So I'll start with an insight from the Korean armistice, something that President Eisenhower and his team had to contend with early on. Ri, the president of South Korea, vociferously opposed the armistice. He wanted Korea unified and all Chinese forces withdrawn from Korea. Koreans filled the streets of Seoul and other cities throughout South Korea to demonstrate. Most South Koreans supported President Ri's stance that an armistice should not be concluded until North Korea was liberated. Ri was intransigent. In 1953, Walter Robertson, Assistant Secretary of State, and General Clark, the commander of the United Nations forces, were conferring daily with South Korean President Ri, threatening him with an American pullout if he did not cooperate in the armistice, promising him virtually unlimited American aid if he did. Ri resisted the pressure, helped by reports from the United States that seemed to indicate a near revolt by Republican senators against their own administration. Today, perhaps that's European allies instead. Republican leader Styles Bridges and Joseph McCarthy believed that freedom-loving people should applaud Ri's defiance of the armistice. Ri, by the way, also enacted martial law to circumvent the need for an election. On July 5th, the acting majority leader, Senator Noland, blamed Eisenhower for a breach with Ri and announced his support for Korean unification before any armistice agreement was signed. Despite the clamour, Eisenhower insisted that Robertson and Clark be firm. They were, and ultimately persuaded Ri that it was futile for South Korea to try to go it alone. On July 8th, so this is 6 months into the new Republican administration, 15 days ahead of the Korean Armistice Agreement being signed, Ri finally issued a public statement promising to cooperate. This is from a second volume of a biography on Eisenhower. What got Ri to cooperate? Had Ri not made the highly provocative move of releasing 27,000 prisoners, to the dismay of US mediators, North Korea and China having expected them to be repatriated, South Korea would not have received a security guarantee with the US, the Mutual Defense Treaty, that otherwise at that point had not been settled. A great part of Ri's bargaining power with the Eisenhower administration derived from his undoubted commitment to Korean unification. American officials considered him obsessed and irrational on this subject. He may have been. Ri finally agreed to abide by the armistice only after receiving a promise of future US support, a mutual security treaty with the United States, and a major aid package, and after a series of heavy Chinese attacks aimed specifically at South Korean units nearly destroyed 2 Republic of Korea army divisions. Now, there are several reasons why the Korean War is not analogous to Ukraine. There are no UN or US troops fighting in Ukraine today. Few people are suggesting that tens of thousands of US troops should be stationed in Ukraine after a ceasefire, and I'd just like to say very clearly I'm certainly not advocating that while drawing this comparison. But if President Zelensky is at all reminiscent of President Ri of South Korea, and I assert that he is, Zelensky will likely remain intransigent until Ukraine receives some kind of credible security guarantee. Now, I'm titling this slide deck, How Ukraine Diplomacy Can Be Saved. And I will just say that I've been thinking about how this could be done for nearly 2 years. The following is intended to be helpful to the Trump administration, who I'm very much rooting for. And I'd just like to offer a few out-of-the-box ideas that could potentially revive diplomatic momentum. Our aims a fair outcome for Ukraine, that doesn't provoke President Putin, that secures and stabilizes Europe at minimal ongoing US expense. And the following builds on work from March and April 2022 and due credit to Turkish and Israeli diplomats. I'd just like to set 3 principles. I decided to do something untraditional, propose a highly detailed plan and try to get both sides to react to it. Until both parties could react to a substantive plan, it seemed to me that they would keep fighting over vague concessions and hypothetical solutions rather than coming to the table and negotiating a deal that would last long after it was signed and executed. That's from Jared Kushner's brilliant Breaking History. All the time I've known him, he's gone for the essence of the problem. Well, yes, there are all sorts of details that have got to be sorted out. But don't we agree that this is really the main issue with which we've got to wrestle? And if we agree on that, then we can get all sorts of experts to work out the details. But if we just give it to the experts and tell them to work it out, they'll never get anywhere. You must tell them what is the essential, where do you want to get to, and then they can work out how to do it. That's Edward Heath, former British Prime Minister, speaking about Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union. And though doubtless many people who might watch this video today are ardent critics of the European Union, Jean Monnet was brilliant at getting many countries with differing views to come together and act together. Act constructively. And countries can't change their neighbours. This is from the most recent PM of Singapore. The following is structured in 3 sections. First, a security guarantee that Russia might agree to and that might actually work for the US administration. Second, territory and normalization and pushing the bounds of creative thinking. And thirdly, ceasefire terms and how this could be brought about rapidly. So first, a security guarantee paired with military restrictions. Here's how I think it could be done. The 1953 Korean Armistice Agreement was remarkable in that it combined a US security guarantee on the one hand with, in Clause 13D, restrictions on weaponry that could enter South Korea. This is the actual text from the Armistice Agreement. I'll just read this passage. Cease the introduction into Korea of reinforcing combat aircraft, armoured vehicles, weapons and ammunition. Weaponry may be replaced on the basis of piece for piece of the same effectiveness and type. Every incoming shipment of these items shall be made to the Military Armistice Commission and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, which then comprised Sweden, Switzerland, Czechoslovakia and Poland. This demonstrates how to grant a security guarantee while being sensitive to the other side's desire for arms restrictions for a country on its border, Russia not wanting long-range missiles pointing directly into its territory. An equivalent Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, I would suggest as contenders, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Turkey, India, perhaps Brazil, could be put together today. In Korea, such an arrangement deterred further invasion without provoking the North or China. My resulting suggestion is to separate a security guarantee, which should be robust and is in itself non-provocative, from infusions of further weaponry, which are intolerable to Russia, and understandably so. Emulate Clause 13D of the Korean Armistice. Without a security guarantee, US mediators, this is the lesson from Korea, will experience unrelenting intransigence from the leader of the country they are trying to help. This is what it took Eisenhower 6 months, really, to muddle through. Continual recurrence of the conflict will likely come about, as the Budapest Memorandum, which was an empty promise, and the Minsk agreements have shown. Investors and reconstruction funds are unlikely to come in at scale, and more than 8 million Ukrainians now abroad are less likely to return home. Now, who should back the security guarantee? My suggestion is an alliance fracas. France, the United Kingdom, and just to begin, the United States. So in the acronym, the US expressly comes last. This should be fronted by Europe. The US is to backstop it only for 7 years. After that, it sunsets. So 7 years, after 7 years, US involvement sunsets, and Poland, which spends a commendable 4.1% on defense, and Germany replace the US, and it becomes friends of Ukraine and the US. Crucial, I think, in this, Germany and Poland should not be included at the outset. This would later be perceived as the US stepping out. I think it would actually make it more difficult for the US to extricate itself, and it would lead to a great diminishment of the guarantee. Rather, as the late Dr. Kissinger would surely have attested, an equilibrium needs to be maintained. Poland and Germany stepping in 7 years in place of the US would be the best means Europe has of achieving this. Now, just to be extremely clear, that this is not some kind of elaborate ruse to suck the US into the conflict. I'd like to be very clear. Unlike NATO, fracas would not come with joining NATO's integrated military command, housing US or Western military bases in Ukraine, joint military exercises, foreign legion troops, or Western long-range missiles stationed on Ukraine's soil, all of which are opposed by Russia. Fracas is to apply only to territory that Ukraine controls behind truce lines. Again, this is emulating the Korean armistice. And if Ukraine were to attack Russia, the security guarantee would be voided. Fracas would not support Ukraine, and any false flag attack would leave Ukraine alone without allies. So this is an incentive to try and keep some unruly militias in check. A US security guarantee would require 2/3 Senate approval, as it did for Eisenhower, and there are learnings from the Korean example to emulate. We actually have the text of what was presented to the Senate here for anyone who cares to read it. Having it sunset after only a few years would surely make it easier to pass. Just in the actual European dynamics of this, I would suggest have Macron feel powerful. He felt snubbed by both the US and the UK with the 2021 AUKUS deal, and use this arrangement to light a match under Europe getting its own defence industrial base on track. Macron is still, quite understandably, annoyed about not getting even a phone call from Biden prior to both AUKUS and the Afghanistan withdrawal. There's a clip here of Macron speaking about that. Europe today is arguably being difficult because it feels a little bit sidelined rather than involved, and this would be a way to involve it. France and the UK have been the most vocal supporters of Ukraine's defence, at various times suggesting they wish to send their own troops and wishing to extend NATO membership to Ukraine. NATO membership should not happen, but France and the UK should back up their own words by signing a robust security guarantee for Ukraine. The US shouldn't be the only country in the world capable of underwriting a credible security guarantee. A lesson from history. The wording of NATO's Article 5 was the object of heated negotiations. Europeans wanted members to commit themselves to military and other action, while US diplomat George Kennan, a hero of some on the US team today, proposed only such action as may be necessary. Eventually, a compromise was reached. In the event of an attack, members will assist the relevant country by taking forthwith such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force. You can click through and read it. This is the actual wording of Article 5. That's worth just a quick skim. Not since the ratification of the United States Constitution have so many men spent so much time drafting and debating so few words. The words are there for the taking. The actual text of Article 5 should be emulated by fracas. So this would be a real security guarantee. France, the UK, and in time Germany and Poland would be signing up to say, if Ukraine is attacked again, we are sending our own troops. It's a real security guarantee emulating the Article 5 language, but it's without NATO membership and it's without NATO troops being in Ukraine. President Eisenhower's agreement in Korea, that again, crucially in sequencing, first committed to a security guarantee, has stood for 72 years and counting. And so my humble suggestion, Mr. President, fracas would help us get your forthcoming peace agreement into the league of such company, enduring for decades to come. Why would Russia allow for this? Russia could permit a security guarantee from got to be careful saying fracas, from fracas for Ukraine in exchange for a clear restriction on Western weaponry that can enter Ukraine, especially long-range weapons such as US HIMARS and ATACMS and British and French Storm Shadows. This assured by a neutral nations supervisory commission and a recommitment for Ukraine not to host foreign military bases, which in 2022 was precluded by Ukrainian law. Advisors and mercenaries, including contractors, to leave the country. No stay-behind intelligence. The possibility of further countries which back the security guarantee to be shut down explicitly in the founding agreement. So there is no risk of fracas becoming a backdoor to NATO 2.0. Further, a clear mechanism established for disputes between fracas and Russia, managed by parties that maintain relations with both sides, to reduce the potential for escalation, a false flag attack or the like. And Moldova and Georgia, both non-NATO, both not yet EU members with very small armies, are remaining points of vulnerability in Europe, near to Russia. They might ask for coverage under fracas as well. This is worth dealing with all in one go, either bringing in or explicitly ruling out. I'd just like to say that in 2023, former President Bill Clinton expressed his sense of personal guilt about the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, saying, "I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country." This was the agreement for Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons on its territory in 1994. US officials today can hopefully, in some small measure, empathize that Ukraine, as terrible as its diplomacy has been in many ways, Ukraine does feel scarred from lacking a security guarantee. And I think this explains some of Zelensky's behavior. In the words of Zelensky to Lex Friedman in January this year, USA, Britain, Russia, France, China, did anybody come? Referring to the Budapest Memorandum assurances, no. Did anyone reply to these official letters recorded by diplomats? Did anyone conduct consultations? No. And why not? They didn't give a fuck. That's an exact quotation. To bolster this arrangement, following 7 years of peace being ensured by fracas, the moment that the US would step out, its responsibility would sunset, Ukraine ought to lower its conscription age, which is presently at age 25, lower this to 18, and further boost collective European deterrent credibility. If such a security guarantee could be agreed with Ukraine first, the rest of the deal will much more easily fall into place. One quick additional point, this is just being recorded a week after the original video. In exchange for fracas, the security guarantee being formalized, Zelensky ought to rescind his decree from October 2022. This was a decree ruling out the possibility of any talks with Putin and Russia at all. Zelensky is to rescind this and agree to negotiate directly with Russia. Number 2, territory and normalization. The US does have leverage. I'm kind of sick of reading media pieces suggesting that it doesn't. Option A, this is kind of the boring, bog standard default, would be freezing lines of control, the Korea model. Ukraine does not recognize loss of territory, and the roughly remaining 80% is perhaps referred to as Western Ukraine. Of particular note, something not enough people mention when talking about this, is that President Ri of South Korea didn't personally sign the armistice. The Republic of Korea's general signed it instead. You can click on this link, you can look at the actual armistice agreement, and you'll see here that it has the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army, and that the actual president's signature is absent. The president of South Korea, never signed the armistice. Does the Ukrainian president necessarily need to sign an armistice agreement himself? Interesting question. Cartography be damned. Call the line the 47th parallel. Korea is obviously separated very close to the 38th parallel. This is a matter of geography. This is nothing to do with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the 34th president, but call the line in Ukraine the 47th parallel. Guarantee Ukraine's shipping through the Black Sea, and a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO has suggested, with this particular model, despite being far smaller in terms of population and land, Ukraine could overtake Russia in a few decades in terms of GDP. Whether or not that's possible, I can't really comment on. I'm not an economist, but it's perhaps the most rose-tinted version of this arrangement that's been proposed. Option B, a much more ambitious, a much more creative, full measure resolution, and 8 carrots that could bring about a genuine reset. The first is a long-term solution for shared water management in Crimea. This is something that Elon Musk mentioned way back in 2022, including joint reconstruction of the Kakhovka Dam. We put a little link here with details of this that show just how crucial the water supply is to Crimea, and even if Russia is totally occupying the territory, and even if it's recognized under international law, which I won't comment on for now, it's a lot more inhabitable without a long-term solution for water. Russia really needs this to come together, and it would obviously be in Ukraine's best interest as well. An estimate has suggested it would be roughly $1 billion and 5 years to reconstruct. This is something that Russia would really welcome. Second, the US and allies could of course lift sanctions dating back to 2014. I suggest this would not be including Nord Stream 2. That should remain closed, or at least one of the Nord Stream pipelines should remain closed, and it should never have been allowed in the first place. But this would include Russia's Arctic LNG 2 project, which could lead to great prosperity, and the option for Russia to return to SWIFT, though it might actually not wish to return. I don't know. Number 3, the US and Russia to rejoin an updated version of the Open Skies Treaty. The Open Skies Treaty, again, one can click through on this and just read a little bit about it. It was proposed by Eisenhower. It wasn't actually picked up until Clinton going on Bush, but it's effectively a treaty that allows non-military reconnaissance flights over the territory of other countries. The US actually proposed this. The Baltic countries desperately want Russia to rejoin this. Russia itself actually wants to rejoin this, but it will not do so unless the US rejoins. The Baltic countries obviously wanting visibility of troop buildups by being able to fly their planes over parts of Russia. President Trump and then Secretary Pompeo did leave the door open in 2020 when pulling out. There's a chance we may make a new agreement or do something to put that agreement back together. This would be very, very welcomed by certain countries in Europe and by Russia itself. Number 4, the US could assist Russia with its satellite early warning system so that it can see submarine missile launches from the North Sea, which would reduce the likelihood of a false alert, which of course is in mutual interests. This would be a hugely significant thing to put on the table. MIT physics professor emeritus Ted Postel has picked up on something here that I've heard nobody in the non-technical mainstream talking about. He's put together a piece here detailing it. I will briefly summarize it by saying, in Ted's opinion, in his scientific opinion, Russia has visibility of a very small strip of ICBM fields in North America, and if there were a submarine nuclear missile launch from the North Sea, Russia would not have any satellite visibility on this because its sensors simply are not good enough. You can read all about it in the piece. President Trump's uncle, John G. Trump, was of course an MIT physics professor. He might perhaps warm to this. There are interviews dating back to the 1980s where President Trump is talking about his uncle and how he would like to broker nuclear arms treaties. Number 5, revive the INF Treaty, Russia and the US together aiming to bring Beijing in as a signatory. This is obviously in their shared interest. President Trump having said in 2018, let's really get smart and let's none of us develop those weapons. In tandem with this, refresh the New START Treaty, which is set to expire in less than a year. And again, Russia and the United States working together to include China, this would very much be in Russia's interest as well, and hypersonic missiles. Number 7, this is kind of an interesting idea. If you take Russia's most intimate ally, arguably Belarus, and you give Belarus a carrot to come to the table, which would be lifting particular sanctions on Belarus, including restrictions on potash. We've done a very short write-up here. What on earth is potash? Why is it important to Belarus? But it seems to be one particular sector that is really, where sanctions are actually really working and proving to be pretty potent. If you get Russia's most intimate ally on board, that's a kind of interesting carrot. And number 8, a detailed discussion about wider security concerns in Europe. Russia is strenuously asking for this, and hopefully Europe has a seat at the table for discussions about its own continent. For all 8 carrots, my suggestion is ask for agreement to form a new autonomous region in the territory that Russia has taken since 2014. This is where things get a little bit creative. So this is a map, this is the occupied territory. Option A, going back to the frozen conflict, Korea-style deal, freezing lines as they are, everything in red, and this not being internationally recognized. You put the 47th parallel all along the red line. Option B, the 8 incentives, the territory in red is made into a new autonomous region, and residents are encouraged to either assimilate or emigrate, being ensured a passport and citizenship wherever they choose to settle, whether that's Ukraine, whether that's Russia, whether that's the autonomous region. You have separate voting rights for each. There's a very brief case study. In Cyprus, a population exchange was brokered by the UN in 1975. Approximately 1,800 Greek Cypriots moved south, while 60,000 Turkish Cypriots went north, internally displacing more than a third of the island's population. Today, 99.5% of Greek Cypriots are in the south, and 98.7% of Turkish Cypriots live in the north. The population of the occupied territories in Ukraine is estimated to be around 3.5 to 4 million today. So some precedent that this could actually be done. What to call the region? And again, having this region, I assert, would make things a lot more face-saving for Ukraine. Before I come to my wacky idea, I just want to retell a quick anecdote that Rick Grinnell has put forward in an interview. on settling a thorny naming issue in Kosovo and Serbia negotiations in 2020. Rick said, "This is another of those, it only works if there's an outsider thinking differently type situations. We were negotiating about several things between Kosovo and Serbia. The traditionalists, the Balkan experts at the State Department, all said, you've got to sit down at the table and talk about political issues. But we've been doing that for 21 years and nothing has been done. President Trump said, go in and start talking about economic normalization. See if you can get things moving in terms of railway agreements, economic development, and job creation. There was this lake that is largely in Kosovo, but some in Serbia. And each side calls the lake by its own name. We saw that this lake was an opportunity for economic development. It wasn't being utilized properly. This feels reminiscent of the occupied territory today. Both sides said, we can't call the lake what they, the other side, are calling the lake. We got stuck on the name of a lake. Now, obviously, in Ukraine, it's disputed territory. It's not just a name, but continuing. We're creating jobs, having US engineers come in to look at the dam and hydropower and all these interesting aspects. And we kept coming back to the name of the lake. So I jokingly said, I'm going to start calling this Lake Trump. And immediately both sides said, actually, we could go along with that. It's the compromise to a very complicated issue. But it started off as a joke. I'm going to pose a question to the viewers of this video. What is the 47th state? The answer is New Mexico. The second question. What does a map of the occupied territory look like? I'll give you a moment to ponder. I'm going to propose that minus Crimea, does the shape not look quite a bit like an inverted California? You have the angle at pretty much the same place. To me, it looks like an inverted California. Like 1850s California, the region has the potential to be refounded with prosperity from mining. And with fresh eyes, this does sound mad, but a bear and a star, does the California flag not kind of look Soviet? Call the new autonomous region New California. We have a flag mocked up here, the red, white, and blue, New California. I'd just like to be clear that I'm not suggesting this becomes US territory or even US administered territory. But California, despite Gavin Newsom's attempts to ruin the states, has long been an emblem of prosperity. And mediators here are clearly trying to put prosperity first in the negotiations and to allow politics to follow economics. John Hume, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Good Friday Agreement, famously said, you can't eat a flag. Today, this is a suggestion that, of course, only the 47th president could pull off. Now, how to make the territory as prosperous as possible, and something that the US could add mightily. Demine the territory at warp speed. Ukraine is now the most heavily mined country in the world. Agricultural and food exports from Ukraine are estimated to be almost $9 billion a year lower due to mines. This is affecting the food security of many African countries and leading to more than $1 billion a year less in annual tax revenues for the Ukrainian government. Demining Ukraine is projected by think tanks, this is the Tony Blair Institute, and charities to take over 10 years and to cost $34 billion. Adjusted for inflation, the Manhattan Project cost only $30 billion over the entire duration of World War II. This is arguably not thinking in an innovative way. The Trump administration could commission the most innovative US robotics companies, Gecko Robotics, Anduril, Boston Dynamics, and Optimus as part of Tesla, and emulate the tender process of Operation Warp Speed. This could be used as an opportunity to get US robotics supply chains in gear, which Mark Andreessen has warned of the urgent need for, particularly with respect to China. Turn demining, which is often a dangerous nuisance, into a treasure hunt. And instead of leaving it to NGOs, task the US private sector and demine the territory in a tenth of the time at a tenth of the cost. There would be an enormous return on investment to doing this at speed. If you allow the typical timeline to play out, this will have a detrimental impact on Ukraine's GDP to something to the tune of 66 billion. If you did it at warp speed, you'd unlock something like 55 billion in economic value. The US taking the lead for demining would produce massive gratitude towards President Trump, irrespective of where the actual lines are drawn. It would be internationally lauded. The Biden administration is partly responsible for this, having provided cluster munitions and American anti-personnel landmines. It would stimulate innovative US defense and robotics companies, and it would re-demonstrate to the world what US industry can do. Further economic opportunities, these are of course more than already on your radar. The region has plentiful natural resources to be remade prosperous, unlocking Ukraine's mineral wealth. Perhaps the 300 billion in frozen assets as part of an agreement could be used to finance reconstruction of the territory. There is the immense redevelopment potential of Odessa within Ukraine, but if the conflict continues, Ukraine needs to know that it severely risks losing Odessa for good. Zelensky himself has pointed to the oil reserves in the Black Sea. One set of Nord Stream pipelines ought to be turned back on and reduce European energy costs. Russia, via the autonomous region, would have guaranteed access to Crimea via the so-called land bridge, and you'd have wide-ranging powers over language and cultural policy. With this, Russia, we would ask, drops its additional territorial claims to Kherson and Zaporizhia, where it argues referendums took place in territory it has never controlled, and in turn, Ukraine would relinquish further monetary claims on Russia for damages done during the war. If Russia can't be persuaded to go along with this creative option B, the 8 carrots, and collective financial incentives to make the territory an autonomous region, option A, a Korean-style frozen conflict, would be a tolerable arrangement to end the war. But I suggest making clear, option B will not be offered again. This is only worth our doing if it's fast. If it's going to be protracted, it is not worth it to the US. Section 3, we come to ceasefire terms. In public remarks, Russia insists that the ceasefire comes after a proposal that addresses the root causes from their perspective. Here I suggest terms for a ceasefire, and this is best read from left to right. In favour of the Russian Federation, number 1. The notion of Ukraine joining NATO to be dropped, perhaps Georgia too. The aspiration for joining NATO to be removed from Ukraine's constitution and a restriction put into US legislation. This is much easier for Ukraine to do if it has fracas already agreed. In return, Russia's reassertion of Ukraine's independence and sovereignty. Ukraine is an independent country. Number 2, as already mentioned, restrictions on long-range weaponry allowed into Ukraine, emulating the Korean armistice, this assured by a neutral nation's supervisory commission. In exchange, Russia is to withdraw missile units from Crimea. We have a demilitarized Crimea. Number 3, no further US long-range missiles to be delivered to Germany. This is something that Responsible Statecraft has written about, which is scheduled at present for 2026. In return, Russia is to remove nuclear weapons from Belarus that it moved there in 2023. China would be on your side here. China opposes the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus as well. Number 4, non-nuclear status of Ukraine reaffirmed and reasserted by the Ukrainian president. He did make a few quite worrying remarks in October of last year. That to be totally shut down. Ukraine is not going to acquire nuclear weapons. Number 4, Russia is not to give any further arms or air defences to Iran or the Houthis, and it's to assist, as it is beginning to, the US with Iran. Lavrov said in January of last year, Israel is our long-term ally or our long-term partner. So just building on that comment. Number 5, Ukrainian forces entirely out of Kursk and North Korean troops out of Russia. Russia is to cease any help to North Korea with its missile and nuclear programs. Number 6, facilitate Russia's agricultural exports, reconnecting its state agricultural bank to SWIFT and reopening a particular ammonia pipeline. In exchange, Ukraine is to be permission from Russia for partial EU accession, and an outline of what this means here. I'm not going to go into the detail of this because it's quite technical and it's better read than presented, but we have a plan that ties partial EU accession to freedoms for minority languages, which is the thing that Russia really wants. So coming to that, number 7, protection for Russian speakers and enshrine freedoms for the Russian language and the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So you basically intertwine these two things. You give Ukraine what it wants in partial EU accession, or at least permission for. It has to have its negotiation with the EU, but Russia allows that to happen. And then you make the Council of Europe, which is a separate body from the EU, you make that responsible for policing the thing that Russia really wants, which is these particular protections. Russia is to cooperate with the Red Cross in locating and repatriating all Ukrainian children. Number 8, immediate closure and dismantling of all US-supported biological research facilities in Ukraine. I want to be extremely clear, these are not bioweapons labs. They're not weapons labs of any kind, but they seem unnecessary and I would argue should be shut down. Number 8, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is to be restarted and reconnected to the Ukrainian grid immediately. Let's have a full lasting energy infrastructure ceasefire. Number 9, Washington to reverse its permissions on the use of advanced long-range weapons into Russia, and Russia both to cease any use or threatening any use of further use of ballistic missiles, and its Orezhnik missile not to be sent to Belarus. On a personal level, for the two leaders, President Putin's international arrest warrant to be dropped by the ICC. This, of course, is not entirely within US powers, but it can be encouraged. And physical protection assured for President Zelensky and his family. These are the terms that I think, after putting forward a plan on territory, could actually bring about a ceasefire quite quickly. Just go into a tiny bit more detail. The issue of language rights is to be resolved in tandem with partial EU accession and getting the Council of Europe to oversee and police that. We have a 3-page plan about the language issue. You can click through and read that here. But in brief, it would be standardizing the treatment of EU and non-EU languages in Ukrainian legislation. So it's not making it particularly about Russian, it's just making it about non-EU languages in general. And something that Hungary has been advocating for strenuously, ensuring protections for Hungarian minorities in Ukraine as well. Something that Lavrov routinely mentions in interviews is Article 1 of the United Nations Charter, encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And transit of gas through Ukraine, which was halted on the 1st of January of this year, to be restored. Hungary and Slovakia will block Ukraine's any kind of partial EU accession without this energy transit dispute being resolved and renewal of it for a very long time. Just to define neutrality, as it has different meanings to all sides, to be very specific, therefore, on what neutrality means, it means Ukraine will not join NATO, and it will drop the aspiration for joining NATO from its constitution. Ukraine can, however, become an EU bridge member from Russia's perspective. This would be minus all future integrated defense elements, if in any way the EU were to develop them. After the war, Central and Western Europe, Ukrainian sentiment undoubtedly is Western leaning. Anybody can see this just looking at Gallup. But there should be sensible guardrails on how far the country as a whole is allowed to move in the direction of the West. With these terms, Ukraine and Russia signed to confirm a ceasefire, led by the Red Cross, the UAE and Belarus, which have done great work on this thus far, the release of prisoners all for all, repatriate the bodies of the fallen, and a crucial detail, Ukraine agrees to end martial law and swiftly hold a presidential election. Media talking points. Once this is agreed, the US is able to say, we intend to offer Ukraine a real security guarantee with our European allies, FRUCUS, effective immediately. Almost every analyst on February 24th, 2022, thought Ukraine would be rolled over and capitulate. That did not happen. The majority of Ukraine will emerge independent, free to rebuild itself as a prosperous democracy. That's a credit to Zelensky and his people's heroism. President Putin would be able to say, we wanted to stop Ukraine joining NATO, housing US long-range missiles and military bases on its territory, and to get protections for Russian language and culture. We got it. And Zelensky would be able to say, we have a real Western security guarantee for the first time in our country's history. And we're going to become an EU bridge member with a track to fully fledged EU membership by the early 2030s. In terms of peacekeeping troops, I assert this should be done by UN troops. UN troops should man the border. They are the only neutral peacekeepers Russia is likely to accept. And propose that Brits and the French put their energies into a new joint military base in East Poland instead. And of course, this should be called Fort Fruck. UN peacekeepers to be paid not from the main UN budget, of which the US pays an outsized 25 to 27%. But General Kellogg thankfully has the answer, writing in April of last year. We also call for placing levies on Russian energy cells to pay for Ukrainian reconstruction. This brilliant idea could be extended to specially fund UN peacekeeping troops. So a moderate supply of Russian energy to Europe can finance the peacekeepers and discharging talk of a deal with the devil, as European media like The Economist presently puts it. Ask a figure like Eric Prince to propose a zero bloat troop number and configuration. So having a sensible amount of Russian energy with a levy, this would bring down European energy costs. It would keep American LNG prices competitive, and it would help bring down the recent rebound in US inflation. European natural gas prices are roughly an eye-watering 4 times higher than those of the United States. European countries will not get to spending 2.5% or more on defense sustainably, as is needed without cheaper, diversified energy supply. Following the announcement of Stargate, the US will, I suggest, need more of this energy at home to build out its Manhattan Project, build out of AI data centers, and Ukraine's peacekeepers would thus be administered by the United Nations, specially funded by a levy on responsible energy flows to Russia. I will close just with this very crudely drawn graphic of a four-way bargain, a kind of reverse Mexican standoff. The US would be lifting sanctions on Russia. Russia would resume a moderate supply of energy to Europe, and via this, Ukraine would receive funding for its border protection and its reconstruction, and Europe would be agreeing to a significant increase in defense spending. This would be a win for the United States, it would be a win for Russia, it would be a win for Ukraine, and it would be a win for Europe. If you think of the reverse of this, or just the event of such a deal not coming together, I humbly assert that the status quo is not sustainable. Russia right now has its central bank interest rates at 21%. Its inflation is a domestic problem. The US has a vassal continent in Europe, at least in regards to defense. It needs Europe to be able to step up. And Europe desperately needs cheaper energy supply, and Ukraine needs funding for its reconstruction. The status quo is not sustainable. And so this gives me some hope, just in the sense of the grand incentives of this crude diagram suggest the incentive structure is on the side of diplomacy. It is on the side of a deal as difficult and as fraught as attempts at mediation, of course, are. I just want to close by saying that I suggest all of this with the utmost humility. I have worked at the nerve centre of government with the chief advisor to the British Prime Minister in 2020, all through COVID, and therefore I know how obscenely difficult it is. I therefore also have some sense of how much there is I don't know. I'm sure that I've gotten things in this video wrong, and I do not come close to having every answer. Everything from the outside looks easier. A few of the ideas contained here, of course, are wacky, but conventional thinking is unlikely to get the US and the wider West out of the present predicament. This was my best attempt to share a few ideas that I hope could be helpful before the opportunity for peace becomes a lot more difficult. For anyone who's made it this far and watched through, thank you very much for watching.